The Taiwan Strait is 110 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point, and it has been, for the better part of 3 decades, the most precisely watched body of water on the planet. Every surface vessel that crosses it is tracked. Every submarine that approaches its approaches is monitored. Every aircraft that enters its airspace is identified. The surveillance infrastructure that the United States and its partners have built around the strait, the sensors, the satellites, the collection platforms, the analytical architecture that processes what they gather, represents the accumulated investment of an intelligence community that has understood, for a long time, that the strait is not just a waterway. It is a signal. What happens there, and what is allowed to happen there, tells the world something about the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific that no diplomatic communique can fully substitute for. The People's Liberation Army understood this. They had understood it for longer than most of the officers currently commanding their forces in the region had been in uniform. And they had spent years looking for a way to change the signal without triggering the direct military confrontation that their strategic doctrine, in its current phase, was designed to avoid. They were not looking for a battle. They were looking for a demonstration that the strait was no longer freely navigable, that the cost of transiting it had become high enough, unpredictable enough, and technically sophisticated enough that the calculation of whether to attempt it had changed. The weapon they chose for that demonstration was one of the oldest in the naval arsenal, updated with a sophistication that the original designers of underwater mine doctrine could not have imagined, and wrapped in a deployment architecture so carefully constructed that the 6 hours between its discovery and the moment the USS Carrier Strike Group was scheduled to enter the strait's southern approach were, by every planning assumption that had preceded that morning, supposed to be zero. The minefield had been placed over 19 nights. 19 nights of operations conducted by a combination of assets whose individual activities, viewed in isolation, had each been assessed as falling within the range of routine PLA naval activity in the region. A Type 039A submarine conducting a transit through the strait's deeper water channel, assessed as a routine patrol. A surface mine layer operating under the cover of a scheduled maritime exercise, assessed as consistent with published exercise notification. 3 autonomous underwater vehicles launched from a PLA Navy vessel operating in international waters south of the strait, assessed as oceanographic survey operations, which the PLA conducted regularly in the region and which generated a volume of AUV activity that had become part of the background pattern against which anomalies were supposed to stand out. The mines were not conventional. They were not pressure-activated or magnetic-influenced devices of the type that defined the mine warfare doctrines of the 20th century. They were mobile, autonomous, networked warheads, a capability that the PLA's Naval Weapons Development Program had been working on since the assessments published following the 2003 Iraq War identified the strategic impact of mine warfare on coalition naval operations. The MANW system consisted of individual warhead units, each approximately the size of a large underwater drone, capable of autonomous repositioning within a defined operational zone, networked with each other through an acoustic communication protocol that allowed the field to behave as a coordinated system rather than a collection of independent hazards. Each unit contained its own propulsion system, its own sensor suite for target classification, and its own engagement logic that could be updated remotely through the acoustic network. The engagement logic was what made the system categorically different from anything that had preceded it. A conventional mine waits. It sits on the bottom or floats at depth, and it detonates when a vessel with the right physical signature passes close enough to trigger its fuse. It has no judgment. It has no selectivity beyond its physical detection parameters. The MANW unit had judgment, a target classification algorithm that could distinguish between a surface warship, a submarine, a commercial vessel, and an autonomous underwater vehicle based on the acoustic signature propulsion pattern, and magnetic profile of the contact. It could be programmed to engage specific categories of targets and ignore others. It could be programmed to activate only within a defined time window. It could be programmed to reposition itself if the tactical picture suggested that its current location was suboptimal for intercepting its assigned target category. The field had been programmed to engage surface warships consistent with the profile of Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Burke-class destroyers. It had been programmed to ignore commercial traffic. It had been programmed with an activation window that began 8 hours before the scheduled arrival of the U.S. Carrier Strike Group at the Strait's southern approach. A window derived from the intelligence assessment of the strike group's transit schedule, which had been tracked by PLA collection assets for the preceding 11 days. The field was positioned across 3 transit lanes in the southern section of the strait, covering the navigable water between the 20-meter depth contour on the Taiwan side and the 35-meter contour on the mainland side. Its individual units were positioned at depths between 15 and 45 meters, distributed across an area of approximately 80 square nautical miles. 80 square nautical miles of water, containing 47 autonomous warheads, each capable of moving toward a classified target and each networked into a system that would concentrate the available units onto the highest priority target detected by any sensor in the field. The field had been in position for 6 days when an MH-60R helicopter conducting a routine anti-submarine patrol north of the strait's southern entrance detected an anomalous acoustic contact at 4:22 a.m. The contact was not a submarine. Its acoustic profile was inconsistent with any propulsion system in the rotary wings classification library. It was a propulsion system, that much was clear from the frequency characteristics. But it was running at a power level and a shaft frequency that corresponded to something smaller than any submarine, with a noise floor so low that it had been below the detection threshold of the helicopter's sonar until a thermal layer inversion at approximately 4:15 a.m. had briefly focused acoustic energy in the layer where the contact was operating. The contact was moving. It was moving slowly, less than 3 knots, on a bearing that the helicopter's sensor operator could not immediately correlate with any surface vessel or subsurface asset in the area. It was simply a thing that was moving slowly through the water at 40 meters depth, generating a faint propulsion signature that did not match anything on file. The sensor operator classified it as unknown mechanical contact at 4:28 a.m. and transmitted the report to 7th Fleet. At 4:31 a.m., a second contact of the same type appeared on the sonar picture, 2 nautical miles from the first, on a slightly different heading. Both contacts were moving. Both were at approximately the same depth. Both had the same unclassified acoustic profile. The analyst at 7th Fleet who received the dual contact report at 4:44 a.m. had been working the Taiwan Strait surveillance desk for 14 months. She had seen every category of contact that the strait generated: submarines, surface vessels, fishing boats, AUVs from 3 separate national programs, oceanographic equipment, biological contacts, geological acoustic events. She had never seen 2 contacts of this acoustic profile moving in the same operational area at the same depth on converging headings. The profile was too consistent for biological. The movement was too directed for oceanographic equipment. The depth and speed were inconsistent with any classified propulsion system she had seen. She flagged both contacts as Priority 1 unknowns at 4:47 a.m. and requested immediate expansion of the acoustic surveillance picture across the southern approach area. By 5:30 a.m., the expanded surveillance picture had identified 11 contacts of the same profile in an area of approximately 40 square nautical miles. 11 moving, depth-holding, propulsion-generating unknowns distributed across the water. The carrier strike group was scheduled to enter in approximately 8 hours. By 6:15 a.m., the assessment had been completed. High confidence that the contacts were autonomous underwater mine units of an advanced type not previously attributed to the PLA operational inventory. The assessment was based on the contacts' behavioral consistency. The fact that they were holding depth and moving slowly in patterns that suggested position-keeping behavior rather than transit behavior. And on a classified technical intelligence report distributed 3 months earlier that had described a theoretical PLA underwater mine system with autonomous mobility as a developmental capability. The report had assessed the system as being in late-stage development. The assessment had been wrong about the timeline. High confidence. 11 confirmed contacts. An unknown number of additional contacts below the current surveillance picture's detection threshold. 8 hours before the scheduled Strait entry. At 6:30 a.m., the Pacific Fleet Commander was on a secure call with the Chief of Naval Operations. What followed over the next 6 hours was an operation that had no precedent in the U.S. Navy's operational history, because the threat it was responding to was itself without precedent. There was no doctrine for the clearance of an autonomous networked minefield in a contested strait with a 6-hour window while maintaining the freedom of navigation transit schedule. The transit schedule was not merely logistical. It was strategic. Every hour of delay was a signal. Every transit that did not happen was an argument, made in water rather than words, that the strait was no longer freely navigable. The Pacific Fleet Commander understood this with a precision that the political guidance she had received made explicit. The transit would occur on schedule or within a window that did not constitute a visible capitulation to the constraint. She had 6 hours and 47 autonomous warheads that knew what she was sending. The mine countermeasures plan was built around 3 simultaneous elements. The first was passive, a complete acoustic mapping of the southern approach area using every available sensor platform, conducted to establish the full extent of the field and the positional status of every identified unit. The mapping used MH-60S helicopters with AN/AQS 20-towed sonar systems, MQ-8C Fire Scout unmanned helicopters with acoustic payloads, and the P-8A Poseidon's sonobuoy field capability operating at a density that turned the southern approach zone into the most acoustically surveilled body of water in the Pacific. By 8:45 a.m., the mapping picture had identified 31 contacts. By 10 a.m., it had identified 44. At 10:30 a.m., the count stabilized at 47. A number that subsequent analysis would confirm was within 1 unit of the field's actual total. The second element was active neutralization. The deployment of the Mk-18 Mod 2 Kingfish unmanned underwater vehicle, operating as an explosive ordnance disposal asset, to physically neutralize identified mine units using shaped charge placement. Each Kingfish carried 2 neutralization charges. The destroyer USS Steatham launched 6 Kingfish units at 7:15 a.m. from a position south of the field boundary. The units entered the field in coordinated teams, their navigation systems operating in a mode that suppressed their acoustic signatures below the MANW unit's detection threshold. Or, more precisely, below the threshold the PLA engineers had set the MANW detection algorithm to activate on. That threshold had been derived from an intelligence assessment of typical U.S. Navy mine countermeasures vehicle signatures. The Kingfish units operated below that threshold. The MANW units did not engage them. 41 of the 47 units were neutralized by Kingfish-placed charges between 7:15 a.m. and 11:40 a.m. in an operation that required constant tactical management of the Kingfish navigation to prevent any unit from approaching an MANW at a speed or bearing that would cross the engagement threshold of the MANW's short-range acoustic detection system. 3 Kingfish units were lost during the clearance, 2 to MANW units that detected their final approach during the placement sequence and executed their engagement logic before the neutralization charge could be set, and 1 to a MANW unit that had repositioned from its mapped location between the time of its last acoustic fix and the time the assigned Kingfish arrived. The repositioning had been approximately 30 meters, a small distance, but sufficient to place the Kingfish's approach vector inside the MANW's engagement sector, rather than its blind spot. 3 Kingfish units lost, 41 MANW units neutralized, 6 remaining. The third element was the carrier strike group itself, modified. The transit was conducted with the carrier positioned at the rear of the strike group's formation rather than the center. An unusual configuration that placed the highest value asset in the last position, maximizing the buffer of surface combatants ahead of it. The lead destroyer was equipped with the AN/SL-61 Littoral Combat Ship Mine Countermeasures package, temporarily transferred from an LCS operating in the region, whose surface and subsurface decoy systems were capable of generating false acoustic and magnetic signatures designed to attract and prematurely trigger magnetically or acoustically fused mines. The SLQ-61 decoy systems activated at 12:15 p.m. as the lead destroyer entered the mapped field boundary. The first MANW response occurred at 12:18 p.m. A unit that had been mapped at the northern edge of the remaining 6 activated its propulsion system and began moving toward the decoy signature at its maximum sprint speed. The lead destroyer's sonar tracked it, transmitted its position to the battle network, and a Kingfish unit held in reserve for exactly this scenario was released at 12:19 p.m. The interception geometry required the Kingfish to close from 400 meters in approximately 90 seconds. It completed the neutralization at 12:21 p.m. and 17 seconds, as the MANW unit was still accelerating toward the decoy signature. The second MANW response came at 12:24 p.m. 2 units simultaneously activating from positions on the western side of the transit lane. Their networked communication having coordinated a joint approach designed to saturate the strike group's port-side countermeasure coverage. The coordinated approach was the MANW network's most sophisticated behavior. The emergency concentration protocol that the field's programming triggered when it assessed that a target was within acquisition range of multiple units. The 2 units were moving on diverging approach vectors that would have been difficult to counter with a single Kingfish. The lead destroyer's CIWS was reconfigured for underwater engagement, a capability that existed in the system's mode library, but had been used operationally exactly twice in the U.S. Navy's history, both times in cleared training areas. It engaged the Western MANW unit at 12:25 p.m. as it entered minimum effective range. The engagement was a proximity intercept, the 20mm rounds detonating the unit's warhead at a distance of 41 meters from the destroyer's hull. The pressure wave from the warhead detonation was significant. The watch officer on the bridge described it as a sharp upward jolt transmitted through the hull, lasting approximately 1.4 seconds, sufficient to throw loose equipment from the navigation console and cause a sailor on the bridge wing to lose his footing and strike the safety railing. The ship's sonar dome sustained minor pressure deformation. Its combat effectiveness was not compromised. The second unit of the Western pair was engaged by the reserve Kingfish at 12:26 p.m. and 44 seconds. The remaining 3 MANW units did not activate during the transit. Post-transit analysis suggested that their classification logic had not achieved the confidence threshold required to trigger engagement against the strike group's modified formation. Possibly because the rear positioning of the carrier placed it outside the optimal detection geometry of the Western sector units, or possibly because the detonation at 41 meters had introduced acoustic interference that disrupted the network's final coordination protocol. The 3 units continued their position-keeping behavior as the strike group cleared the northern exit, holding depth and bearing as though still awaiting a target that had already passed. They were subsequently neutralized by explosive ordnance disposal teams operating from a forward-deployed MCM vessel that entered the strait at 2:15 p.m. The carrier cleared the northern exit of the Taiwan Strait at 1:47 p.m. on schedule. At 2 p.m., a diplomatic communication was transmitted to Beijing through established channels. Its content acknowledged the minefield's discovery, its composition, and its removal. It did not use the word protest. It did not use the word violation. It stated facts, and it stated them with a precision that was designed to communicate exactly one thing. Everything was known, everything was documented, and the transit had occurred regardless. The response from Beijing, received at 4:30 p.m., did not acknowledge the minefield. It described the U.S. transit as a provocation and stated that China's maritime rights in the strait would be defended through all necessary measures. The statement was noted, filed, and distributed to the appropriate intelligence assessment teams for analysis. At 6 p.m., the carrier conducted standard flight operations in the South China Sea. Now the accounting. 47 autonomous networked mine units deployed over 19 nights. 44 identified through acoustic mapping by 10:30 a.m. 41 neutralized by Kingfish mine countermeasures units. 3 Kingfish units lost during field clearance. 2 MANW units activated during transit and engaged. 1 by CIWS at 41 meters, 1 by reserve Kingfish. 1 warhead detonation at 41 meters, causing hull pressure deformation and minor crew injuries. 3 remaining MANW units neutralized post-transit by EOD teams. 0 ships lost. 0 critical casualties. 6 hours and 47 minutes between first contact detection at 4:22 a.m. and transit entry at 12:15 p.m. 1 thermal layer inversion at 4:15 a.m. that briefly focused acoustic energy onto the first contacts layer. 1 MH-60R sensor operator who classified an unknown acoustic contact as a priority 1 unknown rather than a biological. The PLA minefield was a genuine operational achievement. The MANW system represented a capability development that had been substantially ahead of the timeline the intelligence community had assessed, deployed in a manner that demonstrated operational patience and technical sophistication, and positioned in a way that was designed to be below the detection threshold of the surveillance architecture covering the strait. It had almost been. The detection had required a thermal layer event that was not predictable and had not been planned for by either side. Neither side had planned for the thermal inversion. The thermal inversion was meteorological. The acoustic phenomenon it created, the focusing of sound energy at 40 meters in the southern approach zone at 4:15 a.m., was not the product of any intelligence operation or tactical decision. It was the product of the particular temperature differential between 2 water masses that met in that location at that hour of that morning. The MH-60R helicopter was where it was because its patrol pattern placed it there. The sensor operator was listening because listening was his job. The Taiwan Strait does not grant access as a favor. It grants access to those who have built, maintained, and operated a surveillance architecture capable of finding a contact at 40 meters depth at 4:22 a.m., and then finding 46 more before noon. The transit happened because the strait was watched. The strait was watched because that is the standard, not the exceptional standard applied when a specific threat is known. The standard applied every night, at every depth, whether anything is expected or not. That is the margin. That is always the margin.